Let me begin by wishing everyone Shavua Tov, and we'll begin on Kuf Yud Daled Amud Beis with the word Pshita. So we're counting up from the bottom. We started this last week. Let's go over it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines up from the bottom. Hecha de'ika shar yerokos, mevarech al shar yerokos bar pri adama via achil, v'hodar mevarech achilas mar via achil. So if he has the ideal situation, he has a yerek for Tibul Rishon, he'll make the Birchas Hanenim Bar Priadama on the first Tibul of yerek. He'll have in mind that Bar Priadama will cover him for the second Tibul of Chazeres. Before the second Tibul, he recites a Birchas HaMitzvah al Achilas Mar. And we added that even though Mar Bismana says only D'Rabbanan, but nevertheless, we can say Asher Kidshon Mitzvos V'Tzivanu because the Torah has authorized the Rabbanan to institute Takanos, Yagos, and Mitzvahs. Hecha Deleka Lechasa, Mai. What do we do in the case where he only has Chazeres? For the first Tibul, he doesn't have any other Yarek. And if you take a look here in footnote number Lamed Ches, in the name of Rabbeinu David, that if we're going with Mitzvah Ein Tzrichas Kavana, then it's simple and there's nothing to vacillate about because he fulfills his Mitzvah Mara with the first Tibul, and therefore he certainly should be reciting the Bracha al Achilas Mara. However, if you hold Mitzvah Tzrichas Kavana, then since he has within his power to have a Kavana Shelo Lotzes, and he doesn't want to fulfill the mitzvah of Chazeres with the first Tibul because he wants to fulfill the Seder, the sequence of Matzah first and then Mar second, so he doesn't have Kavana in the first Achila. Or on the other hand, as we'll see in the name of Chizda, on the next Amud, he should have Kavana to be Yotze with the first Tibul. Amar Rav Huna Mevarch Meikara Amara, that if he only has Chazeres for the first Tibul, he should recite Bore Pri Hadama on the first Tibul, v'achil, and eat it. Ulubasof, when he gets to the second Tibul of Marar, Mevarch Alea al Achilas Marar v'achil. So it's Rav Huna's opinion, and we'll soon see the dissenting opinion of Rav Chizda, that he should postpone his mitzvah of Marar until after the matzah, and that's because mitzvah tzrichas kavana, so he has kavana not to be yotze with the first tibul, and he'll recite the bracha of achilas Marar on the second tibul. And here we have a long footnote, number Lamed Tes, which I'd like to study with you. We also have to go back, B'li Neder, if you could remind me, to Lamed Vav. But now we'll focus our attention on Lamed Tes. Rav Huna holds mitzvah tzrichas kavana, and he has kavana shelo lotzes with the first tibul, and therefore only at the second tibul will he fulfill his mitzvah marar and proceed with the bracha of al achilas marar. Now Rabbeinu David says the following. And you'll see that this is based on a kasha of the Shagasari. The Gemara says that according to Rav Huna, this is a Gemara in Masechet Pesachim Mem Beis, mitzvahs ain't tzrichas kavan. And therefore, we should interpret that according to Rav Huna, even though mitzvahs ain't tzrichas kavana, as we saw in the Gemara in Sukkah, and he fulfills therefore his mitzvah of Mara with the first tibul, nevertheless, the bracha of Achilas Marar should be postponed until the second Tibul. And why is that so? Because the din of Kol HaMitzvahs Kula Mevarch Aleim over L'Asiyasan is only a mitzvah lechatchila. That's the ideal, that the mitzvah requires a bracha before it. But if he didn't make the bracha before it, then he makes the bracha after it. So he should not make the bracha al achilas mar on the first tibul. And the reason for that is because he's waiting for eating the matzah. And if you'll argue, well, the bracha has to be recited before the mitzvah, how can he make the bracha after the mitzvah? He's already fulfilled the mitzvah. If Huna holds mitzvah saying tzrichas kamana with the first tibul b'chazeres, the answer is that we can fulfill our obligation of mitzvahs brachos, of bracha al mitzvah, even after the mitzvah was implemented. B'di'evet, that's not the ideal way, but we'll do that and opt for that so that we somehow link up and connect to the second tibul. Now, he points out that there's a whole list, like a who's list in Rishonim, that have the girsa pshita hechad ika shar yerokos mevarech lechol marar v'achil. The language of a brach of lechol marar sounds more like al achilas marar, which is impossible because he's doing a tiva with shar yerokos. Hechad lekel achasomai. Omer Avhuna mevarch meikara amorar bar pi adama v'yachil ulbesof mevarch al achilas mar v'yachil. So let's see how the Rishonim make any sense out of this text. As long as he's eating marar before he tasted from the marar, then he makes a bracha lechol marar instead of al achilas marar. Like in tefillin, lehaniach tefillin, or in Chanukah, lahadlik ner shel Chanukah, with a lamed. Yeshar kol mitzvah shevarach aleim over lasiyos. In other words, the bracha with a lamed indicates that what we're about to do later, we're making the bracha now la for the future, and the bracha came before the implementation of the Ma'aseh mitzvah. But in the case of Rav Huna, he already fulfilled his mitzvah mar with Tibul Rishon. So the lamed of lechol is inappropriate because now it's going back in time. Now, even if you'll hold, let's say, mitzvah strichas kavana, and he didn't have in mind kavana to be yotzei his mitzvah mar with the first tibul. Nevertheless, it's similar to making the bracha after he has already fulfilled the mitzvah, because he did the Ma'aseh mitzvah. He ate from the maror, albeit shalol l'shem mitzvah, but the physical, mechanical, external act was identical with the mitzvah itself. And therefore, he could no longer recite the words lechol mar. So he says, Afal pishalo ochel shemarar, he did not eat the first tibul for the purpose of fulfilling the mitzvah of achilas mar. Harei zeh kimavarech li'achar kiyum mitzvah. I mean, these words should be underlined. And therefore, based on this new girsa, the text in the Gemara, we're going to recite, according to Rav Huna, on the second tibul, a bracha of al achilas mar, not lechol mar, because he's already eaten the mar, not for this purpose of the mitzvah, but as an external act of achilas mar, and therefore the mitzvah, the bracha shifts from lechol mar to al achilas mar. All right. Let's go back for a moment to footnote number Lamed Vav. And he quotes a Tosfos who maintains the position that Ein Birchas Bar Pri Adama Shel Tibul Risha Poter Samar Mipnei Sha'agoda Hiya Hefsek. So whereas Rashi and the Rashbam assume that when he has in mind, when he made the Bar Pri Adama on the Yerek at the beginning of the Suda, meaning at the Tibul Rishon, that Bar Pri Adama will cover the Achilas Chazeres later on. Tosfos disagrees. Tosfos says you have the Haggadah in between, and that is a hefsek between the Bar Pri Adama that he recited on the Yerek at the time of Tibul Rishon, and the Achila of the Kazayas Mar later on. But the Rashi and the Rashbam are of the opinion that even though we do say that Haggadah is a hefsek for Netila, and we're going to require another Netilas Yadayim, so he did a first Netilas Yadayim before Tibul Rishon, because when you dip a Yerek into water, into a liquid, you need Netilas Yadayim because of Tumah V'Tara. And nevertheless, when we get to the Matzah, we're going to require a second Tefillah, a second Netilah. And the reason for that is because between the first Netilah and the second, he recited the Haggadah, which is a hefsek. Maybe he was distracted and he didn't focus all the time on keeping his hands absolutely clean and neat because he was busy reciting the Haggadah. He might have touched a part of his body that requires another Netila, Makom Tinofes. As far as Tumah V'Tara is concerned, there may have been Hesech Hadas, but as far as Achila is concerned, there was no Hesech Hadas. When he was reciting the entire Haggadah, he knew to anticipate that at the end of the reading of the Haggadah, he will eat the maror. And therefore the bracha on Tibul Rishon, namely Bar Pri Adama, is meaningful according to Rashi and the Rashbam, and carries over to the Achilas Maror after the recitation of the Haggadah. That's not the sheet of Tosfos. Tosfos is of the opinion that just like the Haggadah is a hefsek in Hilchas Tumah V'Tara, that he was Mesiach Das between the first Netilah and the Achilas Matzah, therefore he may have touched Makom Tinofes. So too, according to Tosfos, by analogy, the recitation of the Haggadah is a hefsek between the Borei Pri Adama before the first Tibul and the Achila of the Matzah of the Maror later on. Now, according to Tosfos, it would seem that he requires another Bar Pri Adama on Tibul Sheni, despite the fact that he already recited that bracha on Tibul Rishon B'Yeret. No, it's not true. In theory, conceptually, Tosfos would require another bracha of Bar Pri Adama on the Yerek, which is now Chazeres, that he eats after the Haggadah, because the Haggadah was a hefsek. But in practical terms, Tosfos is going to agree, for a different reason entirely, that he does not repeat the bracha Bar Pri Adama on the maror. And that's because the maror is now being eaten within the framework of a su'uda, and the kickoff of that su'uda when he ate the matzah was Hamotzi Lechem Min Haaretz. That bracha of Hamotzi Lechem Min Haaretz, according to Tosfos, will pater him from a Bar Pri Adama on the chazeres that he ate after the matzah. Are you following me? So there are two ways of understanding why he doesn't need a Bar Pri Adama on the chazeres that he eats after the matzah. One reason, Rashi and the Rashbam, is because Haggadah is not a hefsek. So that the Bar Pri Adama that he recited before the Tibul of Yerek Rishon will carry over to Yerek Sheni. The other reason is Tosas, that he doesn't require another bracha because he makes Hamotzi Lechem in Haaretz on the matzah and sets up a Suda, and that bracha covers him for all Yerakos, including Chazeres. I really have a personal problem with this Tosfos. While it's true that a Yerek, and even Chazeres is a Yerek, is part of a Suda, but not Marar. I mean, I like to add horseradish to my fish, to my gefilte fish, but that's not what I'm doing here. Here I'm eating a kazayas of Marar, not less than a kazayas. Is that part of the Suda? But you may recall, months ago, we learned in Harei Kedem that on Leil HaSeder there's a halacha of Su'uda. You remember the Rambam says, Kishesoid Adam V'Layla Zeh. And the Rambam requires Haseba during Matzah, during Dalit Kosos, but there was a definite halacha of setting up a Suda. We called it a feast of history. And the Marar is an integral part of that Suda. Not as a regular Suda that I eat the whole year round, but as the Sudas mitzvah of Leil HaPesach. I'll give you an example. Have you ever been at a Sudas Pidyon Ben and they give out like little bags with garlic and different things in that? You know, that's for the minhag. I don't know whether you'd make a bracha on that. It's not part of the Suda, but maybe the Suda of Pidyon Ben is the Sudas mitzvah, and any minhag that you have to eat something special for that Sudas mitzvah of Pidyon Ben is integrated into the Suda. But in this footnote, which apparently is based on the Drisha, one of the great commentaries on Shulchan Aruch, he emphasizes that Yerakos moshchim es halev lamachal. Do you see those words? That the eating of vegetables stimulate the appetite. And once again, I have a problem with that. I understand that certain vegetables or salads or whatever you have could stimulate the appetite, but not chazeres. Okay, technically it's a yerek. I can't deny that it's to be subsumed and defined as a yerek, but to say that it's moshich salev lachila, I don't know. But he's saying that that's the biological truth about any vegetable, including horseradish. Or maybe he's eating romaine lettuce. And that's going to stimulate his appetite, and therefore it becomes integrated into the framework of a Suda, and the Hamotzi Lechem in Haaretz on the matzah patters up the chazeres from a broch. Now he raises the famous question about whether you should recite a Borei Nefashos after the first tibul. You ate a yerek. Again, I'm not getting into the question I think Steve raised about Kazayas or not Kazayas. Leave that out for a moment. But in theory, in principle, he should be making a Borei Nefashos Rabbos. And certainly the first tibul stands on its own, independent of the Suda. But the only problem is that according to Rashi and the Rashbam, the Borei Pri Adama that he recited on the Yerek at Tibul Rishon is going to carry over to Tibul Sheni. And the opinion of Rashi and the Rashbam is that the recitation of that God is not a hefsek. But Borei Nefashos Rabbos would certainly be a hefsek, because that would terminate his achila of Yerek Rishon. So according to Rashi and the Rashbam, we have to do away with Borei Nefashos Rabbos. But according to Tosfos, it's exactly what we should be reciting. Borei Nefashos Rabbos. the Bar Pri Adama, what am I going to do with the Mora after the matzah? The answer is Hamotzi Lechem Min Haaretz. So according to Tosfos, I'm not carrying over and attaching the Bar Pri Adama of Tibul Rishon, of Yerek Rishon, over to the Mora. For sure not. I have my own bracha of Hamotzi Lechem Min Haaretz, and the Mora is part of the Suda. Then make a bar nefashos rabos after you eat after you eat the Yerek Rishon. Do you see Rabbi say this is unbelievable? We're learning a machlokes that has to do with whether recitation of the Haggadah is a hefsek between the achila of Tibul Rishon and the achila of Tibul Sheni. Who would even imagine that machlokes about the status of Haggadah as a hefsek or not would have any bearing on whether or not I should recite Borei Nefashos Rabos? But the machlokes here is a far-reaching machlokes, because according to one shita, the first Yerek for Tibul Rishon is connected to the second Tibul, which is Chazeres. And that bridge that connects the two will allow the Bar Pri Adama that you recite on Tibul Rishon to jump over, pardon the pun if we're learning Hilchos Pesach, but to pass over the entire Haggadah and land on the Chazeres that he eats for the mitzvah Mara. But no, there's no hefsek of Haggadah, but there's no Borei Nefashos Rabos, which would set up a chatzitza, so to speak, separating the achila of Tibul Rishon with the Yerek of Bar Pri Adama and the achila of Chazeres. But according to Tosfos, Haggadah is a hefsek. Again, we don't need a second bracha of Bar Pri Adama on the Chazeres of Tibul Sheni for a different reason, because it's integrated to the Suda, and we pattern it up with what? With Hamotzi Lechem Min Haaretz. But you ate a Yerek for Tibul Rishon, that generates a chiv of a bracha achrona. You have to make a bar nefashos. Whereas again, for the third time over, according to Rashi the Rashbam, that we're bridging between the bar Pri Adama of the first Tibul Yerek and the Chazeres that he eats l'shem marar, then for sure you don't want to break up that bridge, set up a barrier, and terminate the achila of Tibul Rishon with the bar nefashos. And again, I point this out to you. I get very passionate about this because, you see the fine print here in the Haggadah. Yeah, bar nefashos, no bar nefashos. Okay, it's a technicality. But very often those technicalities that seem to be so dry and nuanced and somewhat insignificant, if you will, really are hiding, if we could only reveal, that which is behind the scenes, below the surface, a tremendous machlokas about the relationship between the first achila of Yerek in Tibul Rishon and the achila of Marar in Tibul Sheni. A major machlokas. And Tosfos L'Shitaso is of the opinion that just like we found a hefsek in Netilas Yadayim and the Haggadah that's wedged between the first Netila on the Yerek Rishon and the Achilas Matzah, that requires a second Netilas Yadayim before he eats the Matzah, so too the Haggadah will be a hefsek between the Birchas Hanenim of Bar Pri Adama on the first Tibul and the achila of a kizayis mara in the second tibul. A hefsek. Why are you washing a second netilas yadayim? Because you're Mesiach Das. The same logic should apply, therefore, as far as Birchas Hanenim is concerned. You need a new bracha. Tosfos found a solution to the problem because we integrate the Chazeres into the Suda, and he's covered by the Hamotzi Lechem Min Haaretz. But fundamentally, conceptually, he requires another bracha of Bar Pri Adama on the Chazeres, unless we can integrate it into the soup. He says, Im eno poter samara shitas atosvis yesh levarich achro after he eats the first yarek bari nefashos. The anu noagim. Who's the anu noagim? I don't know. Anu noagim lechol betibul risho pachos mikizayis. Steve, you with me here? Pachos mikizayis. Kidei linotzel me'as sofik linyan brach achrona. I have circumvented the whole issue. I don't make a bar nefashos. I didn't eat enough marar. I'm sorry, yerek, to warrant a chiyuv of brach achrona. I didn't eat a kazayis. My Rebbe Rav Soloveitchik told us that he would eat a kazayis for marar. Let me take out his Haggadah for just a moment. Familiar with this? This Haggadah was published by Rav Soloveitchik's grandson, Rabbi Yitzchak Lichtenstein. We knew him in his youth as Yitzi. Today he's the Rosh Hashiva of one of the most important yeshivas in New York, which is called Torah V'das. But in any event, back in the day, he published a Haggadah based on the chidushim of his grandfather, of the Rav Zichrono Livracha. And I'm curious to see if he mentions how much karpas he should eat. He writes, Yesh rishonim asobrim ditzorach lechol kizayis. There are rishonim who require achilas kizayis. As we go along, we'll learn about these rishonim. V'chein kosav agra. And the Gaon Mivilna accepted that opinion that requires a kizayis for tibul rishon. Uledeyazu, L'das HaRambam ain't tzarich lahaseh. I don't get it. I have to write a letter to the publisher here. This is very unclear. Oh, the Rambam says the following: Perek Ches Halacha Beis. If you want to look it up, V'lokech Yerek u'mitabel oso b'charoses. Interesting. The Rambam has charoses in Tibul Rishon. The ochel kizayis. The Rambam says black and white have to eat a kizayis. Who v'chol ha'mesubim imo. Kol echad v'echad ochel eno ochel pachos mikizayis. So that goes Maimonios. Os Dalid raises the objection: why do you need a kizayis for karpas? The whole purpose of a kizayis is to arouse the curiosity of the children, and for that, dai bekolshu, sagi bekolshu. And that goes Maimonios rejects the Rambam, and the Tur and the Mechaber, they all paskin no need for eating a kizayis. But the Rambam holds that karpas is a mitzvah achila. In other words, the background was kadesh yishlu atinokos, but it was established as a mitzvah achila, and therefore, as a mitzvah achila, it requires a kizayis. There's no achila less than a kizayis. And this would also justify why the Ram requires that the karpas be dipped into charoses, because anything that constitutes a mitzvah chila balayla requires tibul b'charoses. And the Ram actually holds that matzah requires tibul b'charoses. Now he says, Be'inyan bracha ala karpas. So the Rambam says that he has to make a bracha on karpas. Karpas means tibul rishon, meaning bar pri adama. Now, later on in Halacha Vav, in the same chapter, chapter 8, the Rambam speaks about Achilas Morar, V'yaka korech matzu mor kachas, tabul charos mor. Is Morar mitabel kodem samor b'charoses, v'yachkach mevorech. Okay, this is very, very advanced. We're going to have to spend a lot of time on this. We're not ready for this yet. Wow. Okay, let's get back. Let's see where we are. Okay, we'll get back on track. So Rav Huda holds that the bracha of Alachilas Morar as a birchas mitzvah is going to be recited on the second tibul. And even though, let's assume mitzvah srichas kavani, he wasn't yotze with the first, even if mitzvah ain't srichas kavani, he was yotze with the first tibul. So again, he should not be making the bracha on the first tibul. So if we hold that according to Rav Huna, oblivious to the Gemara in Sukkah, that mitzvah srichas kavana, so he wasn't yotze with the first tibul since he ate it without kavana. That's if you hold mitzvah srichas kavana. And therefore we understand gleich, very simple, straightforward, why he makes the achilas more on the second tibul. But now we had the Shagas Aryeh. He's trying to reconcile Rav Huna here with Rav Huna in Masechet Sukkah, where Rav Huna it's attributed to Rav Huna that he holds that mitzvahs ain't tzrichas kavan. So the Shagas Aryeh now has to raise the question, why should he postpone the bracha of Alachilas Morar till the second tibul? He was yotze with the first tibul. And he says that even though mitzvahs ain't tzrichas kavana, and he fulfilled his obligation of Morar with the first tibul, nevertheless the bracha of Alachilas Morar is going to be postponed until the second tibul. So again, he did the Maisa mitzvah of Achilas Mara in the first tibul if he didn't have another Yerek, but Rav Huna, according to Shagas Aryeh, is maintaining that mitzvah ain't tzrichas kavan, and he was Yotze. So it's not just the technical, mechanical Maisa Achil of Mara, but he actually fulfills his mitzvah. So why would Rav Huna insist that we postpone the bracha of Al Achilas Mara until the second tibul? Just 1 second. So I don't know, I'm tempted to think here, as we discussed at great length in the Meiri last week, that there are two dimensions to the mitzvah Achilas Mara. And although he fulfills one dimension through the mechanical Maisa Achila of Tibul Rishon, of course, Rav Huna is holding mitzvahs ein tzrichas kavanah, but nevertheless, he's still missing a chunk of the mitzvah, which the Meiri called the Ikar mitzvah, which has to be fulfilled later on after the matzah. So perhaps the bracha of Achilas Mara was postponed until after he gets the main kiyum, the primary kiyum of Mara after matzah, which we said was part of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. Well, let me ask you the following question. Just shooting from the hip, so to speak, intuitively, should the bracha of Al Achilas Mara be recited on the technical Maisa Achila, which generates a kiyum of Mara, or should we postpone the bracha until he gets to the spitz, the complete apex of the mitzvah of Mara, which he will fulfill after he eats the matzah? Meaning in a situation which is very rare when you think about it, where there's a separation between, a time difference, let's call it time T1, time T2, between the mechanical external act of the mitzvah, which generates a kiyum mitzvah, and another second dimension of the mitzvah, which will only take place at time T2. Where should the bracha, or when should the bracha be recited? Should we attach it to T1 or to T2, meaning to the technical achila of Mara, or to the full-fledged, complete kiyum of Mara, which is only after the matzah? Can I get some feedback here? I need...
I would...
Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
You in its proper time after the matzah makes sense. That's when you're gonna, because the first one, when you used it, it just so happened you used it as a yerek and not as morar. That wasn't the intention. So in its proper place, coming after the matzah, I think that's when you'd want to say the bracha on the morar.
Right, but we're holding now mitzvahs ain't tzrichas kavanah. Let's say according to Shagas Aryeh. We're going according to Shagas Aryeh. So he fulfilled his mitzvah Mara with the first achila. It's a little bit odd that he didn't make the bracha before that first achila. What are you saying, Steve?
Right. I guess I'm just saying, he's saying, okay, well, that's not the... I know I'm going to have it later, so I'm going to... save that bracha for when, I think it's its most opportune time.
Even though in this footnote, he points out in the Shagas Aryeh that the din of the principle of kol mitzvahs mevarach aleim over lasiyasan is only lechatchila. Again, he doesn't explain why Rav Huna advocates postponing the birchas hamitzvah until after Tibul Sheni, and we can fill in the missing blanks. But it's very interesting because my impression always was that over L'Siyasan is absolutely critical. There's no such thing as reciting a bracha after you fulfill the mitzvah. And that's why I think we have to push into this Shagas Aryeh that although he fulfilled the mitzvah, he hasn't yet fulfilled the mitzvah. It's A and not A at the same time. Meaning that there are two dimensions to the mitzvah of Mar, one of which he fulfilled with the first tibul, because mitzvahs ain't tzrichas kavana. And the second dimension, a second kiyum in Mar, he only fulfills later on in the second tibul after the achilas matzah, and therefore the bracha, according to Rav Huna, is going to be over L'Siyasan, albeit not over L'Siyasan of the complete mitzvah, because long ago he's eaten the maror and fulfilled his basic mitzvah. But let's wait for the clincher of the mitzvah. So let me ask you a question. Again, I don't know if this is a fair analogy, but if, let's say, you have a minhag, theoretically, of waking up in the morning of Sukkot and taking the lulav out there in the sukkah, which I think is based on the Arizal, if I'm not mistaken. Does anybody familiar with that minhag? Yeah.
Yes, it is based in the Ari.
Now, he hasn't yet recited Hallel. He's way before Hallel. And there's a kiyum of lulav that's integrated into Hallel. Could we suggest that, according to Rav Huna, the way the Shagas Aryeh is presenting it, we should, rather than make the bracha al natilas lulav out there in the sukkah al boker, he should rather postpone the bracha until Hallel, when he completes the mitzvah, by integrating the lulav into Hallel. Kol haneshamat al ka, or atzei yar, whatever. What does it say there? Halu atzei yar, whatever the pasuk is. Or another example, let's take shofar. Right, there's Tkiyas de Miyushav, and then there's Tkiyas de Me'uma. Tkiyas de Me'uma al Seder HaTfilah, Seder HaBrachas. Which means the second set of Tkiyos are integrated into the Shmon Esrei, into the Tfilah. Whether it's the Lachash, whether it's the Chazos HaShatz, I'm not entering into that issue. So the mitzvah of Tkiyos de Miyushav is incomplete. It's lacking the dimension of the integration of his shofar into the fabric of tefillah. Could one say, perhaps, according to Shagas Aryeh and Rav Huna, that even though he certainly fulfills his mitzvah of shofar, Yom Trua Yelachem, through the first 30 kolos that he blew, Tkiyas de Miyushav, Shalal Seder HaBrachos, instead of reciting that bracha, he should wait until he integrates the shofar into the Shmon Esrei, which Tkiyas de Me'umad, and that's when the clincher or the additional dimension of the mitzvah is going to be fulfilled, and that's when he should recite the bracha. Just like here in Tibul Rishon, he's going to postpone the bracha, according to Rav Huna, to Tibul Sheni, even though he's Mekayim the mitzvah of Maror with the first Tibul. Let's say, for example, Dalid Kosos. So although every kos we saw is a mitzvah b'ampei nafshe, it's a separate kiyum, but the real clincher or the spitz, the apex of the mitzvah, is when he drinks the fourth kos. Of course, it's keneged dal l'shon shel geula, etc., etc. So maybe, again, we don't have a bracha of asher kitshon tzos lishtos dalid kos, but if we had one, maybe he should postpone that bracha until he drinks the fourth kos, when he has the complete mitzvah. See, there aren't too many cases of mitzvos that are spread or split into two stages, or more than two stages. And then the question is whether he makes the bracha on that mitzvah before the first stage, or maybe before the last stage. Can you think of any other examples? I'm running, my deck is running short of cards here. What would be, again, we mentioned shofar that has two tekiyos, two sets of blasts. We mentioned lulav. It's the original mechanical mida'ag bei nofik bei, and then there's the lulav together with the hallel. I mean, I could come up with cases where the first stage is just a hechsher mitzvah. It's really just meant to be a prologue, an introduction to the real mitzvah. Like, for example, in Ma'aser Sheni, there's Hava, and you bring the Ma'aser to Yerushalayim, and then there's the Achila B'Kedusha in Yerushalayim. But I would say that the Hava Yerushalayim is only a preliminary introduction, a prologue to the mitzvah Achila, and therefore, for sure, he's going to postpone his bracha until he eats the Ma'aser Sheni. But I don't think it's very frequent to encounter a mitzvah where the first part of the mitzvah is integral to the mitzvah and would even clinch the basic kiyum mitzvah, but yet there's a second part of the mitzvah that comes later on, and that rounds off the mitzvah by adding another important dimension or embellishment to the mitzvah. Now, I would be tempted to think, in the light of the Shagas Aryeh, that that bracha should be recited later on. Like, for example, on Tefillin Shel Rosh, for those who have the minhag, I don't have this minhag, but if you recite two brachos, and the second bracha is Al Mitzvahs Tefillin, am I correct? So you have Laniach on the Tefillin Shel Yad, and Al Mitzvahs Tefillin on the Tefillin Shel Rosh. Now, let's say he was mafsik between Tefillin Shel Yad and Tefillin Shel Rosh. So then, if I'm not mistaken, it says in Shulchan Aruch, I have to double check this, let me know if you're familiar with this, that he has to add another bracha on the Tefillin Shel Rosh, and that's Laniach, which he already recited on the Tefillin Shel Yad, but he needs a second one. See, because the bracha on Tefillin Shel Yad has to bridge him all the way to the Tefillin Shel Rosh. And then the Tefillin Shel Rosh requires its own bracha, according to that shita of Al Mitzvahs Tefillin. But let's say he was mafsik, so he's going to have to repeat the bracha of Laniach. So that's the again. I'm looking for more examples, but this seems to be the issue. A mitzvah that takes place over two stages with two maisim. He fulfills his basic obligation with the first maisa, but the second one really rounds it out. That's why I wanted to say that the bracha of Al Mitzvahs Tefillin on the Shel Rosh is also on the Shel Yad. It goes in both directions. And even if he's reciting Lo Aniach Tefillin on the Tefillin Shel Rosh, but on the combination of Tefillin Shel Yan and Tefillin Shel Rosh, he recites another bracha of Al Mitzvahs Tefillin. And this leads us to Rav Chizda on Kuf Tes Vav Amud Aleph. Let's see what time it is. All right, well, I guess we'll pick up Rav Chizda tomorrow, B'li Neder. Let's just make a note. Jeff usually comes on Sunday, does he not? Not sure why. Maybe he's underwater now, I don't know. Anyway. All right then. So tomorrow, B'li Neder Rav Chizda. And you'll let me know if there are any other changes or so. Maybe you told me already, but I forgot. All right. Have a great day. Thank you very much.